Welcome. I feel very happy. We're grateful that Senator Shaheen and Senator Tillis are here with the Senate NATO Observer Group, which is also known as the SNOG, which is fun. And I thought we'd jump right into it. There's been a lot going on here this week, a lot of activity outside of this building around Ukraine, Europe, the administration. But President Zelensky spoke today and had a meeting with the president's envoy, Keith Kellogg. In the background, there's been some mixed messaging from the administration. And something that I and some of the other reporters here have been hearing are some doubts from some European officials about whether the U.S. can bring Vladimir Putin to the table. I wanted to start with you, Senator Shaheen. What do we know about the administration's plan here?
You maybe should start with Senator Tillis.
Okay.
But
yeah.
Look, I think you're right. There have been mixed messages from the administration. I think Secretary of Defense Hegseth spoke maybe out of turn when he said we should take NATO off the table. At least I think he did, because I think we don't ever start a negotiation by giving away all of our leverage. Then Vice President Vance walked that back in his interview. And I think maybe the message is we shouldn't be negotiating in public. Let's figure out what the plan is and then think about the negotiation.
Should we chalk that up to, this is a new administration, we're 3 weeks in, or that potentially there's an ideological component here that's in play?
Well, Tom would know that better than me.
I think the one I was looking forward to your answer on the first question, but I think the one thing that we have to just remind ourselves is go back to the first 90 days let's go back to the Obama transition. First 90 days of the Obama transition, from the standpoint of the losers of that election, was chaos. In fact, I viewed it as so much chaos that I quit my job at IBM because I was convinced it was going to create a political environment in 2010 that would get Republicans in the majority in the legislatures for only the second time since the Civil War. And you're looking at the Speaker of the House who actually led that. That was an overreach of an administration that created a bad environment. This administration has about 90 days to sort things out, be a little bit chaotic. But if we don't get into an ongoing concern, as you would say in business, then I think that we could run into political challenges ourselves come next year. Now, with respect to, there's no negotiations going on. I think that people perceive a negotiation is not a single phone call and then a follow-up phone call with President Zelensky. There is a lot of ground to be covered, and quite honestly, many of us don't believe that Putin, he wants the appearance of negotiation, but he really just wants that world stage to elevate him. And I personally think that he is responsible for war crimes, atrocities beyond imagination, the utilization of mercenaries to rape and kidnap and murder Ukrainians. So I'm not really very optimistic that he's the right sort of person to negotiate with. But I do believe that the president has established a good reputation for engaging even bad people to get a dialogue going. And I think dialogue has to begin a process that ultimately results in a peace that Ukraine wants on their terms.
Is that part of, sort of where a congressional delegation like this steps in? It's a rather large delegation. What kind of message are you conveying to European leaders? Are you I think we know you're probably hearing from European leaders who are expressing some concerns. So I'm curious what kinds of concerns you're hearing from them, and is then the message, hey, we're senators, we're here, we have 6-year terms. The U.S. commitment to NATO is solid, or?
I think among the bipartisan delegation that's here, particularly from the Senate, the commitment to NATO is very solid. We understand as you said, Thom and I co-chair the Senate NATO Observer Group, and we restarted that group to make sure that people understood how important NATO is. And NATO has only gotten stronger since the war in Ukraine began. So I think that's an important message. I think recognizing that we are stronger together, the United States and Europe, in this fight than we are divided. And so that's very important, and doing everything that we can to ensure that Ukraine goes, whenever there's a negotiation, that Ukraine is in the strongest position possible.
And, acknowledging what you said, that this is at the early stages, there have been some bipartisan meetings with senators and President Zelensky. There were meetings with, I believe there was a meeting last night, Marco Rubio met with President Zelensky. Can you talk a little bit about the state of play right now? Where is this right now? What's coming out of those conversations?
Well, I think it's and I was in management consulting most of my career. I think we're in the storming phase of a group dynamic, brainstorming ideas, trying to figure out what the art of the possible is, what the Ukrainian people who have fought and died to defend their sovereignty want. Then we're going to have to normalize some of that with our partners and allies in NATO and beyond. And then we can move forward on meaningful progress. But I think it's in the very, very early stages of discussion. And I think one of the reasons why I believe that the delegation's helpful here is we can dispel some of the conclusions that people have drawn from American rhetoric. I get it. We're very chaotic in our approach, and we kind of enjoy it. But sooner or later, we settle down. I remember when it was Jeanne's idea to reconstitute the Senate NATO Observer Group, and she approached me when I was on Senate Armed Service. And our first NATO conference as the SNOG leaders, we were on our way to Brussels when the president announced that maybe NATO wasn't needed anymore, President Trump, in his first term.
And he was going to pull the United States out.
Yeah, and we were about to land and go immediately to speak to a car. I think it's mutual, too. I don't believe that many of our friends in Europe understand the American systems, and nor do the American members understand your systems at a detailed level. But the fact of the matter is, there is no one person in the United States of America that can make a decision to withdraw from NATO. Our entrance into NATO took an act of Congress. Our exit from NATO would take an act of Congress. And quite honestly, there's never been a president alive since over the 75 years that NATO has existed that would have the influence to have us withdraw from the most important alliance in the history of mankind. So that was sort of the message that we wanted to send. Y'all got to deal with our rhetoric because it is what it is. It's produced a pretty successful, highly innovative, sometimes disruptive nation, but things settle down. Nothing is ever as good or as bad as it seems.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to add, because I think one of the important things and messages that we conveyed to President Zelensky was that we understand that it's very important that Ukraine be at the table, either directly or metaphorically. That, as Zelensky said, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. He's reiterated that again. And I think that was a message that he heard loud and clear from a bipartisan group of senators that he met with.
Is the administration going to be bound by that, do you think?
I think it will be very difficult to do any kind of negotiation on ending the conflict in Ukraine. I hope we learn something. I hope the administration learns something from the negotiations ending the Afghan war, because the Afghan government was not at the table for that, and it didn't turn out so well. One
way it sounds like Trump's interest is being captured. Lindsey Graham's been talking about this mineral rights deal, and there's been some reporting that that Zelensky was presented with the deal and he has not yet agreed to it. Is that accurate? Is that being discussed in the background here? What's the state of play with that?
I don't know the current state of play. My understanding is that the discussions were underway.
Okay.
Yeah. Same here. No update.
And so, as co-chairs of the Senate NATO Observer Group, one of the questions hanging over the conference is, whether transatlantic cooperation is healthy, what it's going to take to make it more healthy. President Trump's call for raising defense spending to targets of 5%, are reverberating around this place. Mark Rutte, I think, said on your panel earlier, he said in this room, that it's going to be upwards of 3%. How should we take Trump's call for 5%? Should we take that literally, or is that a negotiating position?
Well, I think if we look at the lapses that we have right now, that should be a future floor. But my goodness, we're still trying. We're spending decades trying to convince current long-term members, including some founding members, to get to 2%. And to my friend, I try to preface all of my discussions around my family about the concept of family. I'm one of 6 children, and I view our NATO partners and allies like family members. We're not friends, we're family. And that means that we have arguments, we have fights. Sometimes we don't talk to each other for months at a time. But at the end of the day, even my sister, who I'm convinced would never vote for me, she is so liberal, and would probably endorse my opponent, there is no doubt that if I were in trouble, my sister would come to my aid. And I think that has to be foundational to the discussion of people in NATO. Does anyone honestly believe if we were threatened, regardless of whether we're the high or the low, that we would not come together and defend the countries of NATO? Of course we would. Now, we also have to have an honest discussion. Pay the 2%, period. We have been well above 2% forever. Don't give the American people a reason to say, why should we spend more? Why should we do more? When countries who were founders of the NATO Observer Group, just look at this. Take this. I see people with uniforms on. They can appreciate this. Over the last 24 years, if you total the shortfall below 2% of the nations who have failed to make the 2% threshold, it's more than $2 trillion, with a T, dollars for our mutual defense and modernization. It's $2 trillion that would have been demand signals that would have increased our industrial base. It's $2 trillion that may have been a capability that Vladimir Putin would not have thought he could stress test the NATO alliance and take advantage of Ukraine. So let's be good family members and tell our brothers and sisters the truth. Your failure to commit to the 2% threshold has made our world more dangerous. Now, don't high five when you get to 2, because I think the sweet spot is somewhere between 2 and 5. And the sooner we start talking honestly that way and getting the dynamic of the family back together, there will be a safer Europe and a safer world.
Well, and that goes to the reason behind this discussion, because it's not, the NATO countries are going to have to get together and they're going to have to decide, because it's a consensus organization. And they will decide both the timetable and the amount, or the percentage. But the reason why we're doing it is the important point. And as Thom said, we are living in a much more dangerous world than we have been at any time that I can remember. Not only do we have Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, we have Xi with designs on Taiwan and looking at when he's going to enter into a conflict to take Taiwan. We have Iran still engaging with terrorist groups across the Middle East who are looking to threaten the West and the United States. We have North Korea that has missiles that can now reach the United States and other parts of the world. And the point of having this defense is so that we can deter our adversaries. And we do that together. We do that through strength, and that's what this debate is all about.
You referenced Xi in there. Part of this conversation, and we heard this from Pete Hegseth, is that the U.S. is focusing on China. What's the appropriate way for NATO? How can NATO members get involved or focus more on Asia? There's a office. Lindsey Graham was talking about that earlier. What needs to happen next? Where does it go from here? What can they do?
Well, I think what has happened at the last two NATO summits have been really important in terms of talking about China, the threat that China presents, and the fact that that threat doesn't stay in the Indo-Pacific. It migrates around the world. And I think one of the most important arguments that I make to people in New Hampshire about why Ukraine matters to us is because our adversaries are looking at what we do in Ukraine. They're looking at whether we're going to stick by our word, whether we're going to stand by our allies. And if we're not going to stand by our allies in Ukraine, then are we going to stand by our allies in Taiwan? Are we going to stand by, if NATO gets attacked? It's a stress test for where we're going to be in the future. And we're fortunate that the Ukrainians are courageous and willing to fight for their country because they're fighting on behalf of a lot of us. And I don't want to see my grandsons go to fight in Ukraine or other parts of the world because we didn't take a stand now to defend our ally when we said we were going to.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today. Sorry.
Was it?
Oh, were you going to say?
No, I told Tom I didn't mean to filibuster there.
Oh, no, that's fine. Do you want to jump in? Let's extend the clock.
I hope we can all agree the world is very small now. And I'm not going to say who the member was, but I think Europe can learn from the clear and present or should understand and recognize the clear and present danger that China represents. Okay, I was describing it to someone who is not as supportive of Ukraine as I am. I am unapologetically and without qualification behind Ukraine and their sovereignty and a good outcome. But we were in a joint session with the Prime Minister of Japan speaking before Congress. I happened to sit next to a colleague who really questions whether or not we should play any role in Ukraine. And I said, this speech, he was sitting next to me, I said, this speech that's about to occur, my friend, he is a friend, is a prime minister from a country down here who's flying over to our country over here to talk about the importance of a country over there. If a Japanese prime minister can come to a joint session of Congress and explain why Ukraine and success in Ukraine is so important, then why should there be any question of any of our European friends and allies about the threat that China represents? He wasn't there to talk about Russia's threat to Japan and Indo-PACOM. He was talking about the clear and imminent threat of China, observing North Korean troops killing Ukrainians and deploying through Russia in plain sight are classic examples of where China is already threatening the safety and sovereignty of Europe. So clearly, we've made progress in the strategic concept. It was a huge amount of work to have China referenced 6 times in a strategic concept. And yet we still have some of our NATO partners and allies that have infrastructure laden with Huawei technology that we consider a strategic threat. So I think this is just another area where we have to recognize the world is very small and getting smaller every day. China is a clear and present threat to Germany as much as it is to the United States and every other country in between, and we should recognize that and be ready to match up against them.
All right, I'm going to let that be the last word. Thank you both so much for being here. We enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.